over the years, P. Mauriat have introduced new models into their collection. And while some interesting things have come along, there are two key models that have remained the standard bearer of the P. Mauriat range. And these are the System 76 for alto and tenor, and the 67R for alto, or the 66R for tenor. And today I'm going to revisit these models, in particular looking at the alto versions and try and pick them apart and work out what the differences are between these two fundamental designs. Okay, let's break down the basics of these instruments before I give them a play. So starting with the 67R, the R stands for rolled tone holes. So the entire instrument has rolled tone holes, and P. Mauriat are very proud to say that the rolled tone holes on their instruments are produced in the traditional method by drawing them rather than soldering them on. The System 76 doesn't have rolled tone holes, but it's very similar in terms of its structure and key layout. When you put your hands on them, they do feel very similar, but there are a few differences. I'm going to touch on these later when we get into the ergonomics of it. They're both unlacquered, as you can see here. And the key difference that you will not see from looking at the instruments visually here is that they both have different bore structures from one another. The 76 here on my left has a broader bore overall than the 67, and that has certain implications on the tone and response, which I shall get into later on. So let's first of all talk about the key work. On both of them, I'm pleased to report that it's very solid and robust. It's always nice to do a sort of bit of a key play test where you take each key and you try and move it laterally to see if there's any play this way, and it feels very solid. A poorly made sax will have a lot of lateral movement this way, which can give you all sorts of problems in terms of pads, sealing, and what have you. But when it's robust in terms of its manufacturing in the first place, you know that you're going to have sort of few issues in terms of things moving around, and you've just got a very good starting point. So it feels very solid in terms of that. Key layout on the two, compared to each other, is very similar. Feels nice under the fingers. They've obviously measured the fingers well, and where the palm keys need to sit and the side keys need to sit for the majority of hand shapes, I'd say, because they both feel very comfortable, and broadly speaking, they're very similar, but they do differ slightly from one another. So I'm going to hone in on a couple of areas. So what have I got here? The System 76. Now on the 76, there's a very obvious feeling of this lip on this E flat key here and on the C key. At first I find it just slightly gets in the way from naturally where my little pinky wants to sit. I just sort of find myself balancing the pinky key kind of on the edge there, which was just slightly uncomfortable for me. But I suppose, again, you just adjust and find a way that makes it work. But it's just that instant. If you come from another sax and you go onto this and you're not used to that, it always catches you out, those sort of little things. And then on the table keys, here on the System 76, the cluster is nice and sort of solidly built, and the keys are close to one another, no glaring gaps, which is always a bad thing in my view. So it's good from that point of view. I do get slightly stuck on the B to B flat on the System 76. You have to sort of almost play with half of the key down or not slide onto it in order to access the B flat, which you can. Whereas on the 67R, you can slide beautifully onto it. So there's just a slightly different feeling on that transition from B to B flat. But otherwise, all very comfortable. Just looking at the action, or talking about the action rather, I find it's quite a nice medium and even action throughout. I would personally, I've often said this in these videos, have it slightly lighter, which the great thing about saxophones is you can always adjust this with your technician. You know, that is not something that's sort of hard sewn in at the manufacturing point. These things can be changed, but you've got a nice even starting point. And then for me personally, I would just lighten it all up, particularly on the sort of the E flat and the C areas where we're dealing with the weaker fingers. And then for me, the weaker fingers on the left hand, the G area, and perhaps some of the table keys, just lighten it up so you can zip around the saxophone nicely. And the same counts really for both instruments there. Now, I mentioned the rolled tone holes earlier on, and even though this is the System 76 in my hands here, and that's a 67 with the rolled tone holes, I did find actually on both instruments that there's a slight stickiness issue. And I think it comes more down to the fact that they're unlacquered instruments. This is a factor that I've seen actually on many unlacquered instruments over the years, that you do really have to look after the surface of the instrument in order to reduce the element of stickiness. And then when you add the additional element of rolled tone holes like we've got on this model here, it can be a little bit of a double whammy. So at first when I was playing on this one here, the 67R, on the G sharp I was getting that classic thing of you're running up and down and then you go for a G sharp and it's still stuck down. So I was pinging it open in order to get it to work. But a few moments later, some powder papers and a bit of cleaning, and it was all operational. But you can just get that slight feeling of stick. It doesn't affect the play necessarily, you just notice it when you sort of massage the keys, that sort of slight stick, which I think is, again, as mentioned, a consequence of the unlacquered finish. You don't so much get on the standard lacquered finishes. So just bear that in mind when you are selecting your choice of finish, that if that is something that really bothers you and the idea that you have to sort of maintain the instrument and work with it a little bit to prevent the stickiness, then perhaps the unlacquered finish is not the one for you and you would go for a different finish instead. It's interesting actually, in my research for this video today and blowing on these two instruments going back and forth, I really almost feel like I've developed a further understanding of the characteristics of these two models and how they compare against one another. And I think it latches onto one fundamental point, which, as mentioned at the outset, is the difference in board geometry between the two of them, which is really responsible for the fundamental differences in tone and response. The fact that the System 76 has this larger bore gives it all sorts of different kind of tonal possibilities and different feelings of approach as a player. So generally speaking, when we have a larger bore, an instrument you could say is a little more resistant. You have to work harder for the tone. And that is the case with these two models here. I feel that with the 67R, because it has that slightly narrower bore, when we play on that model, it just naturally responds a little bit more directly and easily. Whereas on the System 76, we have to work for it a little bit more. It's got a slight extra element of resistance. So I'm just going to demonstrate that point specifically now by starting with a little demo of some low note stuff on each of the instruments. Now if I ramp up the volume a little bit more and do something similar at the low end. this last demo, you can really hear that the 76 opens up, particularly in this range. The reason I wanted to demonstrate the low notes is that this is the end of the tube. So when we're dealing with a larger bore, you really do hear it at this low end, particularly when you push it. You can hear all of the characteristics almost sort of a bit more multiplied down in this area of the saxophone. And I think you can sort of really hear that extra width that you get when you push the air through the System 76 compared to the 67R, which is a little bit more retained in its sound, although it's still big and robust and fruity and all those lovely things that we hear in P. Mauriats in general. You just hear that extra width and kind of possibility and volume with the System 76, particularly in that low area. So there you heard me playing some stuff in the mid-range, arguably the most sort of used area of any saxophone, the most sort of popular and kind of character identifying bit of a saxophone. And again, it's the same kind of factors that I've mentioned up to now, but you really hear it coming into its own there. So with the System 76, that resistance that I feel as a player means that when I push the air through the instrument a bit more, naturally you tend to get that extra brightness in the sound, which is the natural tendency of a saxophone anyway. If you have to push to get the sound, then the brightness comes into play. And that is a characteristic that I've often associated with the System 76, that brightness when you really push it. So you hear that. But behind that sort of brightness and that kind of front on the sound, there's a certain airiness behind it, which is nice because it gives it that extra dimension in the tone on the System 76. Whereas on the 67R, it's almost like there's, instead of that airiness behind the tone, it's filled in with subtle layers, very responsive layers of tone. And that's where it comes down to the business of the 67R being that very instantly gratifying sound, very responsive horn, free blowing and satisfying to play because you blow down it and you get that instant response, which is probably why the 67R is really, overall, I think, if you were to interview most of the players who've tried P. Mauriats over the years, they would say that that is the one that they gravitate towards. So I'm really hearing those characteristics coming out when we do that mid-range test. Just another point to mention in terms of the tone and response and what have you, actually, is a note on the intonation. It's interesting as I run up and down various passages around the middle there and I touch on the middle E on both of these instruments, there's quite a different pitching on that E. On the 67R, it's very centered, and on the 76 rather, it's slightly higher in pitch, a little brighter. So initially you might say, oh, it's a little sharp, but you just have to adjust to that because there is that feeling of it being quite different to the 67R where you need to kind of think downwards in order to get the pitch just there on the System 76. Now, as I conclude up, let's just touch on the subject of rolled tone holes before I really pick these two instruments apart, because I mentioned it at the outset in that P. Mauriat are very proud to use that traditional method of drawing the tone holes, and they always want me to mention it when we're talking in these videos about their instruments. But what I would say is, for me, it's not the overriding factor in what produces that classic sound in a P. Mauriat instrument. Both the System 76 and the 67R sound absolutely fantastic, but for different reasons other than rolled tone holes having any particular influence at all on the sound. It is nice that they're unique and that they're the only ones doing it these days, really. There's not many producing instruments with rolled tone holes, and great, they're using the traditional method of drawing it. We can't really do a comparison as to whether it makes a difference, this one against this, because these are two different models, so that is a subject for another day. But what I would say is that when we focus on the real aspects that picks these two apart, as mentioned before, that bore structure difference makes a massive difference in the way you feel as a performer and player, trying to get the best out of each instrument. That feeling of slight resistance, which can be a really attractive feature for many players who are looking for something to push against a bit more and produce their sort of own character in the sound, which is what we get with the System 76, and more of that instant gratification that we get with the 67R model on alto. And if we're talking in tenor terms, that would be the 66R. And I think that's overall why the 67 model on alto, or 66 for tenor, just appeals to a wider range of people overall when they try these horns. When you put them in a room and you put both of these instruments and perhaps some others as well, it tends to be this one that largely comes out on top for the majority of players, just for that reason that you get that instant sound and all those layers in the sound. Now, of course, that's not to say that you don't get it with the System 76. It's still got that wonderful, big, bold P. Mauriat sort of characterful sound, all the layers in the sound there, but it's just a different way of producing the sound and a different feeling from the player's perspective to produce the sound from the System 76. So overall, that's it from me in terms of picking these two great instruments apart. So I shall see you again on another video soon.